session devoted to philosophy and myth. I objected that I'm not a philosopher. I'm a psychoanalyst. Don't worry, he assured me. Psychoanalysis is only a branch of philosophy. Maybe it is, but the psychoanalyst is schooled in how to listen rather than how to speak. And when we speak, we are immediately held to account for making interpretations. Well, I've done my share of listening to philosophers at this conference, and now that it is my turn to speak, I protest that I am taking up Monty's invitation, and I'm speaking as a philosopher and not as a psychoanalyst. I do not want to be held to account for interpreting what is being said, not even by these three distinguished philosophers, and in particular, I do not want to speak from a position of false authority. As Jacques Lacan would put it, to speak from the position of the one who knows. I prefer to enjoy myself from the position of a philosopher who thinks and takes no responsibility for knowing. Alternatively, by the selection of themes I've made from these papers, I will offer you the myth of their content. You could call it the psychoanalyst myth. Lord knows Professor Eco is an expert in medieval philosophy and theology, and he has certainly established his case for the relevance of medieval thought to the contemporary world. Anybody who doubts this need only consult the bestseller charts of the last few months. Who would dare to think that a brilliant combinatory of semiotics and Thomism would serve precisely the diet for which the mass leadership of America has been starving? It seems to me that Professor Eco knows something about myth that the rest of us on this panel have yet to learn. Eco takes off from the origin of the word symbol in a token that recalls its absent heart, to which it could be potentially reconnected. It was enough to have the symbol to be relieved of any anxiety concerning the other half. The possession of the symbol reconciles us to the absence of its ghostly partner, and the original wholeness of which it is at best the moiety. But somehow, as the practice developed, the missing half and the unity it would restore was no longer identical with the symbol or its mirror, but rather the symbol suggested, evoked, or revealed what was absent. In showing how this romantic or psychoanalytic view of the symbol was prefigured in the Middle Ages, Eco takes us through the theory of the symbol as it was applied to the sacred text and also to poetry, and in relation especially to the task of interpretation. The premise here seems to be that the texts are meant to provide humankind with a token of the truth that would restore their connection with God. The problem was the manifold richness of the scriptures and the underlying unity of the message presupposed. The political and rhetorical task of the interpreter was how to fulfill that famous injunction, all roads lead to Rome. The difficulty, as I understand Professor Eco, was that while the symbol is meant to give us what is absent, the fathers of the church did not want to leave the absence open to infinite interpretation. They wanted to be sure that all roads lead to Rome. But that, of course, alters the nature of the symbol, because it suggests that they have to know what is absent, rather than relying on the symbol to suggest, to evoke, or to reveal. Quis custodiet custodes, who may guard the guardians. From a political point of view, the issue becomes one of authority. Only those in authority may interpret the symbol, even though their authority derives from the revelation that the symbol occasions. The belief is that men can only share a common world if they believe in the tenets of a common culture. I suppose one might call this the subversion of the symbol, which is precisely what happens when authority takes over the life of the symbol for the sake of instituting the continuity of a unified tradition. Hence, the paradox of the symbol being at once juvenis et senex, old and young. From my point of view, this is no longer a symbol, but an imaginary allure that is built upon the constant evocation of a hope that is constantly betrayed, postponed by those who flash it before the faithful. The lure of the imaginary is there to trap the subject in a structure of alienation. This is the point where thinking comes to an abrupt halt in response to the demands of authority. Shakespeare presents the earliest example of the break in this tradition in the case of Hamlet, who insists on thinking rather than following the injunction of the ghost, as Harry Keller's pointed out. T.S. Eliot saw this as Shakespeare's failure to find an objective correlative in the play, a symbol, because Eliot, being a Catholic, could not see that Shakespeare's point was precisely the disruption of symbolic authority. Consequently, I confess that I remain skeptical of Eco's broader claim that the 13th century prefigures the modern concept of symbol, simply in keeping with the notion that what makes and unforeseen by tradition. It was in the modern period that the thread of tradition came to an end, and the hand of authority failed to reassure the faithful, who were suddenly abandoned in the dark. Call this secularization, if you wish, as Professor Fatima has done. But the various metaphysics of history, of which he spoke so eloquently, came to fill this void. The vulgarized belief in rational and material progress, the belief in the inevitable march of history over the confrontations of classes toward the socialist utopia, and the belief in the right of superior races to dominate and exploit the inferior races that inhabit the world. Professor Fatima referred to the dissolution of these philosophies of history. But philosopher that he is, I believe that he neglected to point out that what brought these so-called secular myths of history to an end was not the exhaustion of their appeal, but the fact that they did lead to the cataclysm of 2 world wars and the Holocaust, which set the seal on the hopes of modernity. Professor Fatima points out that we are now without a philosophy of history. And indeed, there is no thread that enables us to transform events spread all over the earth into a unified chronology whose meaning registers at a metropolis or center. Professor Fatima has shown with great skill how one can analyze the various responses to this break in the thread, or this absence, in terms of 3 contemporary schools. One exhibits a nostalgia for what gone. A second is the cultural relativism that fails to examine the historical basis of the discourse it represents. And the third is the split between the natural and human sciences that serves to obscure the question of historicity. I believe that Damir is describing the unsatisfactory state of philosophy in the postmodern world, where history is no longer a welcome topic, precisely because it begs the question that the thinking ego can no longer transform into the reassurances of a worldview unified within the compass of its own experience. In other words, the modern era relied upon the philosophy of a unified history to take the place of the broken thread of tradition. But in the postmodern era, the possibility of this centralized or unified or integrated view of what happened no longer exists. Instead, we find a few aborted theories that attempt to obscure the issue they cannot transform into a meaningful vision of the ego. Let me, for a moment, respond to this situation from a psychoanalytic point of view. I shall then have a few words to say about Professor Shiguro's contribution, and then offer the tentative conclusion. Some of you will have heard Harold Bloom proclaim on Thursday night in this hall that we are living in the age of Freud. At the same time, he insisted it was not the age of French Freud, but of the Jewish Freud. And immediately he went on to offer an illuminating example of the nostalgic archaism that Johnny Damir had described, with his view of Freud's pessimistic insistence on the ineluctability of the past. I believe Lacan is extremely important for a reading of Freud, precisely because he shows us how and why Freud is a seminal thinker for the postmodern era. Let me refer only to Lacan's emphasis on the decentering of the ego in Freud's psychology. Freud showed us that the thinking ego, the ego cognitus of the modernist Descartes, was essentially ideological in its persuasion. The ego thinks from its own point of view and brings everything back to reflect its own ideas and values, regardless of what the case may be. Nietzsche once put it, philosophers want to recreate the world in their own image. Lacan calls this paranoid knowledge, where the ego finds itself inundated or overwhelmed by what is out there. The other side of the ego-centered worldview is a terror and rigidity in relation to any experience or data that do not fit it. Freud did not intend psychoanalysis to be psychology from the point of view of the ego. Hence, the centrality of the book on dreaming, where the ego is significantly fast asleep. Compare, for example, Freud's paradoxical notion that dreams are the guardians of sleep, with the medieval concern to legitimate the custodes, the guardians of the symbol. The centrality of dreaming and the decentering of the subject of dreams liberates Freud from the unifying and integrating rigidity of the ego. Indeed, the very mark of the ego and its censorship in the unified appearance of the dream must first be broken down and unraveled through free association before the subject of the dream can appear. Lacan's emphasis on this decentered thinking of the subject responds to the postmodern discontent of the centralizing and unifying ego that represses, denies, distorts, and evacuates whatever it finds irreconcilable with its own image or idea of itself. Psychoanalysis represents an attempt to move beyond these reflections of the ego, this constant effort at seeing reality in one's own image, or turning the world into a mirror that reflects one's own image. I would suggest a possible connection here from postmodernity to the Middle Ages through their common disenchantment with the speculum mundi, the world as mirror of the ego. But whereas the medieval Christian was called upon to renounce the narcissistic pleasures of the world, summed up under the rubric of pride or superia, for the sake of entering salvation, the postmodern agnostic is invited to go beyond the narcissism of the ego towards a confusing, unmapped, and largely unexplored series of encounters with difference and otherness, in the hope of enriching the experience of life and the possibility of meaning in the world. This is a world made possible by consent to a fundamental law, a world we know from ancient Rome and from the early American Republic, a world that was invoked to some extent by Sheldon Rowland yesterday afternoon, and certainly by Hannah Arendt in The Human Condition. Professor Ishiguro, following Wittgenstein, takes up the question of myth precisely at the point of an encounter with difference and otherness. And she shows how commonly that experience is transformed by means of a binary schema into an experience of opposition. It is precisely the integrated ego that dissociates and represses, and then evacuates and projects, a moiety of its own experience. In the process, it maintains an imaginary view of itself and of the other, locked into a zero-sum opposition. We have come all the way from Professor Eckhart's symbol, which promises the subject an assured connection to its absent heart, and Professor Ishiguro's mythical split, that in its primitive form condemns the subject to an inevitable opposition with its rejected heart. In psychoanalysis, we call this operation splitting and projection, the mechanism of projective identification. It is one of the most primitive techniques of the ego to impose its image and its viewpoint on the psyche and the world. At the least, it is purchased at the price of depriving oneself of access to an enormous range of experience and capacity. At the worst, it sustains a paranoid relation to the other and impoverishes the realm of intersubjectivity if it does not provoke open hostility. Where Jean Guatemala opens up the possibility of exploring a decentered version of history, and indeed of experiencing the world as the space where the plurality of humankind encounter each other in their difference and otherness. Ishiguro warns us against the countervailing tendency to destroy this opportunity by imposing a binary opposition of difference and otherness. She hints, although she does not declare, the full danger implicit in projective identification, in that they do lead to hostility and war. So let me conclude by observing the peculiar paradox that I believe characterizes our postmodern situation. At one level, at the level that Professor Shortsky yesterday called the intelligentsia, we find with Professor Butler an opening beyond mythical unity and mythical oppositions towards a culture based upon flexibility, openness, and generosity towards the other. Here is the decentered world of plurality. But there is another level where myth prevails entirely in its most primitive form, and which has so far gone unmentioned. If World War II put an end to European imperialism, racism, and totalitarianism, thereby exhausting the stock and trade of the vulgar metaphysics of history, it also led to the Cold War and the binary opposition between East and West, whereby each finds their unity by hostility to its countervailing tendency projected into the other. In this deadlock, the world is being literally impoverished by a gargantuan arms race without parallel in history. And we are only saved from total war by the fact that one side cannot destroy the other without being destroyed itself. There is no time to offer you an analysis of this situation in mythical terms, or in terms of the primitive mechanism of denial, repression, evacuation, and projection that hold both sides in their grip. I'm sure Robert Lifton will do so this afternoon. But this is surely the dimension of myth in the contemporary world that holds us all in its grip, committed as we are to one side or the other. As, in the meanwhile, we enjoy this conference, and in it, a kind of Indian summer of plurality, while we ignore the ominous possibility of a nuclear winter all around us. That, I would say, describes the condition of the postmodern world. On the one hand, technological mastery, the comfort, and the freedom to enjoy plurality, and on the other, a deadly opposition threatening to life.